Hi, Kevin Green here. Welcome to Pathways to the Past. This is my second video in a series I'm planning to do. And on this one I'm down here downtown at the Mellencamp Plaza. There's the John Mellencamp murals on the side of this old guitar store here. So in the first video I talked all about the history of the O&M shops, and that got me into a little bit on the early history of Seymour. With this video I decided we'd go a little more in depth with the early times in Seymour and exactly where the original town was and some of the goings on during the early days. So again, I got a lot to go over, so let me find a seat and we'll get started. So Seymour was founded in 1852 by Meedy Shields. Meedy White Shields was his name, full name. So who was this Meedy, and how did he pick this particular area to start his town? Well, Meedy was born in 1805, July the 8th, 1805, in East Tennessee, Sevier County, Tennessee, at a place called Shields Mountain, named after his ancestors. And you can Google Shields Mountain on Google Maps and see the location. It's actually not that far from Dollywood. His parents were James and Penelope Shields, and in my first video I said that they moved as a family up to this area in 1816, but doing more research since then, looks like they came up here earlier than that, probably early 1812. One source even mentioned 1811 as the time frame. So they came up this way and settled near Corydon, Indiana to start with. There was a fellow named John Tipton who was a military man. He worked for the U.S. military, and at the time, in 1812, he was working to quell some of the Native American attacks that have been happening. If you study the War of 1812, the British were providing arms and encouraging the Native Americans to attack white settlers. There actually have been a couple of people killed by them in the area here that became Jackson County, Indiana. And John Tipton was going to try to put an end to that in southern Indiana here. So it seems that James Shields teamed up with about 30 other men, and with John Tipton as their leader, and went around southern Indiana, including coming to Fort Bologna at one point too. The bad incident was south of here, an incident that they call the Pigeon Roost Massacre. That's where the Native Americans murdered 24 white settlers, including 15 children. And then in early 1813, it was March the 24th, John Tipton and his men tracked some Native Americans to a place on the White River that would be north of where Seymour would be later. That incident is called the Battle of Tipton's Island, and then several of the Native Americans were killed in that incident and murdered, and that seemed to really help, that and some other things, to quell the attacks with the Native Americans in the area. So in any rate, James Shields was given 1,200 acres of land for his services in the military. There's some sources that say that was as early as 1812, and that was the reason he came up to this area, but I think it was probably given to him in 1816. Indiana became a state in 1816, and then Jackson County was formed in 1816, so I think that's probably when he was given the 1,200 acres. Now his 1,200 acres of land was, in today's Seymour, would be from about 7th Street and north, including the old city cemetery area, the old country club area, and out towards where Riverview Cemetery is today. James was not particularly happy with the land. It wasn't real good farmland. It was kind of swampy all through this area at the time. So he and his brother-in-law, Thomas Ewing, got into some other business deals, including a couple of different mills. They started a sawmill and also a grist mill up in the Rockford area. Rockford being a thriving town at the time, you know, in the early 1820s by that time anyway. So Meedy, of course, would have came with the family up into this area, and it's said that as early as Meedy being 16 years old, he was guiding flatboats from the Rockford area with local farmers' grain, and floating it down to New Orleans to get the top dollar for their crops down there. So he had a business mind on him early on. His father helped with that deal as well. Looking at my timeline, September the 2nd, 1833, Meedy Shields married Eliza Ewing from Brownstown. Through the 1840s, Meedy's brother and both of his parents passed away. So by 1847, Meedy had inherited the 1,200 acres of land that his father had. But he didn't stop there. He started adding to the lands that he owned, including eventually all the way out toward the White River to the west of where the Seymour is. In 1846, he got into politics. He was elected to the House of Representatives of the Indiana General Assembly that year, was re-elected again a couple of years later. 1850, he purchased some land which today would go from about 2nd Street south to around Bruce Street. That land was owned by the Moore family, Joshua Moore, who was the son of Samuel Moore, who originally purchased it back as early as 1816. So that gave Meedy a large portion of what is downtown Seymour, most of what is downtown Seymour today. Of course, about that time then, the railroad started coming. They knew that the north-south line would come up and would cross over his land. It was headed for Rockford. That was the Jeffersonville and Indianapolis Railroad. Started in Jeffersonville and headed north from there. Now, you may have heard of the north-south line through Seymour, or eventually through Seymour. It's called the JM&I, the Jeffersonville, Madison, and Indianapolis. But to start with, those were two separate lines. The Jeffersonville and Indianapolis went from Jeffersonville straight up to Indianapolis, and to Madison, and Indianapolis started at Madison, went up through North Vernon and to Columbus, and then headed north from that location. And it was actually the first railroad in the state. See, in 1851, Meedy was elected as senator for Jackson and Scott counties, so he was still into politics. April the 27th, 1852, Meedy platted out what would become his city. He drew it out on a map, the location, which he would be speculating at this point because neither railroad, north-south or east-west lines were here just yet. But he marked off about 10 blocks and about 100 lots that would be put up for sale and recorded at a recorder's office in Brownstown. Now that first plat, the location or the area that would entail would be from the east-west railroad to the south, up to 5th Street to the north, and then the railroad tracks, the north-south line to the west, and over to Broadway to the east. I decided I would take a walk and I would show you the outline of what the original town would have been. So to begin my walk of the perimeter of what was the original layout of the town of Seymour, I'm at the railroad crossing where the two tracks cross. The north-south line running this way was the Jeffersonville and Indianapolis Railroad. It came through town the summer of 1852. the east-west line, the Ohio and Mississippi Railroad, came through 2 years later. But the survey and the layout of where the tracks came through would have been done quite a bit in advance of that, so Meedy would have known where they were, approximately where they would be coming through. So he went ahead and early in 1852 laid out the town that was going to become Seymour. And this railroad crossing here, where the two tracks cross, would be the southwest corner of the town. And from this point we'll walk east down and show you where the next corner is. Now coming to the east, I on the south end of the original town, I walked 2 blocks, so I crossed Ewing Street, and I'm now at Broadway here where the railroad tracks cross. Across the tracks over there is the Crossroads Community Park, where the Ohio and Mississippi Railroad shops and roundhouses were built, which I talked all about in the first video. But this would have been the southeast corner of the original town of Seymour. Now across Broadway we have a railroad station that's still standing over there, but that station didn't come into existence until the early 1900s. Now from here this would be the eastern border of the original town of Seymour, so we'll walk to the north now. I should have mentioned that on the south end of the town, following along where the tracks are today, would have been a street called Cincinnati Avenue, which doesn't exist anymore, and the story of why it doesn't exist is an interesting story that I need to get into on another video. So I walked the eastern border of the original town of Seymour for 4 blocks, so I crossed 2nd Street, 3rd Street, 4th Street, and now I'm at the corner of 5th and Broadway. This would have been the northeast corner of the original town. Of course, over here across the street is the old factory, Seymour Manufacturing. It came along 20 years after the original layout. It was built in 1872. Now we will walk along the northern border of the original town. So I just walked the northern border of the original town of Seymour. I'm at Indianapolis Avenue this direction and 5th Street. Same distance as the southern border, except that there were 3 streets to cross. There was Ewing Street, and then the next block was divided in half by Mill Street. Now Mill just runs down to 3rd and then it ends at 3rd Street. That's the way it was originally. I'm sure that was designed to be a residential area, whereas the streets down around 2nd Street were all commercial, being close to the railroad tracks. So I'm sure that's why it stops at 3rd Street. So from here, the western border follows the railroad tracks along Indianapolis Avenue, would go all the way down back to where we started. And that puts us back to the Mellencamp Park. So everything within the borders of what we just walked would be the original town of Seymour when it was laid out. So if you look on the map, there's 10 blocks and 100 lots that were put up for sale. So in the summer of 1852, the north-south line of Jeffersonville and Indianapolis did build their tracks right across Meady's property that he owned, and then up through Rockford to the north of here. Started running trains. November the 11th of 1852 is when the lots went up for sale in Meady's new town. Now at the same time, it was known that there was going to be an east-west line coming through. And Meedy understood the importance of the location that track would cross the north-south line, and he tried very hard to get it to cross his property and where his new town would be. Now most people speculated that it would be crossing at Rockford to the north of here, since it was a pretty thriving community at that point. Maybe it was close to 500 people lived up there. But they were, the landowners up in that area were asking inflated prices for their land from the railroads, whereas Meedy got with the chief operating civil engineer for the survey team that would determine where the east-west line would go. His name was Mr. Seymour. There's actually some questions about exactly what his first name is. It seems maybe it was Hezekiah. I've heard other names mentioned as well. But he offered the railroad whatever properties that they needed to build their shops, and which was the subject of my first video, if you haven't seen it yet. Because of the steep grade to the west, plus the swampy areas to the west of where the crossing would be, Meedy offered to build an elevated embankment to carry the railroad tracks for nearly 3 miles to the west. And then to top it all off, he offered to name the name of the new town after this fellow, Mr. Seymour, so that seemed to seal the deal for him. So the lots went up for sale in November of 1852, and the person who bought the very first lot was named Travis Carter. Travis lived in the area already. He was a carpenter by trade and quite an entrepreneur himself, and became good friends with Meedy and quite a cheerleader for this new town of Seymour as well. So he bought the lot in 1852, but we're going into winter time, so there wasn't a whole lot of activity that started here until the springtime of 1853. And let me show you where that lot is, because the house is still there today. This is the 2-story white house built by Travis Carter in the spring of 1853. It's the very first lot sold in the city of Seymour when lots went up for sale. And notice the smaller building behind the house there. So there's some that say that that was the first house built in Seymour, but looking back through my sources, including a couple of different 1880s histories that were written, they seem to indicate that there were other houses that were built before that one. But it was certainly one of the first ones, maybe about the third one built. Matter of fact, it says that Dr. John Tipton built the first house, one source says. That would have been northeast corner of 4th and Indianapolis Avenue. There's a source that says the second house built was the southwest corner of 3rd and Mill Street. That was to a fellow named Adams, his last name. Meady's possibly could have been the third. Now there's another source that I found actually mentions that Meedy built a temporary 2-room house, and possibly on the lot that he purchased, and that could be the building that's behind the house today. I'm not sure about that, but it could be. It'd be interesting to find out. And speaking of early houses, and something that I found that's kind of interesting, I mentioned that Samuel Moore purchased land here in 1816. His property ran from today's 2nd Street down to about Bruce Street. I'm not actually sure of the width of it, but it was a good portion of land. And it's said that he built a house to live in that today would be located about halfway down the block in the 100 block of West 2nd Street on the south side of the street. That would have been possibly as early as 1816, since that's when he bought the property. But that house, as well as some other houses too, were standing here when Meedy purchased this land and started turning it into a town. So some of those buildings actually were repurposed into things in the new town, including Samuel Moore's house. Is said someone moved into it and opened a shoe shop there to start. Let's see, there was a Thomas McCollum moved into it after that, and it became the first hotel in town. And then it's said that Later, the house itself was moved down to East 2nd Street into the residential area, and Mrs. Gibson lived in it in 1886. And it got me thinking, I wonder where that house is, and could it possibly still be there today? If so, that would be a house in the city of Seymour that was built as early as 1816, which is pretty cool to think about. So the early Seymour, I've got a list of some of the first for the town of Seymour. I'll run through those here for you. First doctor was John Tipton, I mentioned him already. His second doctor was Dr. Hagan. The first store was by Henry Wools. I was a little surprised to find it was a little further north than I would have thought it would be. It was at the southeast corner of 4th Street and Indianapolis Avenue. Second was a store built by Meedy Shields. It was would be south of 2nd Street on the along Indianapolis Avenue. I said the third store was a Dr. Hagan in Cobb. Opened a drugstore on Indianapolis Avenue. First saloon was by James Smith in 1853. First attorney was a Samuel Smith. The second one was Robert Patrick. First justice of the peace was Lee Osborne, who was also the first tanner, which is interesting. First carpenter would be at Travis Carter, which we've talked about. Later in his life, Travis actually also had a hand in starting the hub and spoke factory, which today is called Seymour Manufacturing, as well as helping to start the Seymour Woolen Mills. First hotel, McCollum House, which was the one I mentioned in the Samuel Moore House. Second one was the McLeland House by the same people in 1854. You have the Harvey House in 1854, and then the Faulkner House, 1857. That family, their son eventually would build the Lynn Hotel, which incidentally stood where we're at right now in this park. The first child was born here was a daughter to Jesse Smith. Second was a son to Travis Carter. That was his son named John. That was in 1854. The first death recorded in Seymour was a small daughter of John Redinger, who was the shoemaker. She fell into a vat of slacking lime, which I honestly don't know what that is. The first newspaper was Jasper R. Monroe, who moved here from Rockford. As you'll find, lots of businesses moved from Rockford eventually. Is the Seymour Times. Meedy Shields, he was always finding solutions to problems that would come up, and usually could make money off of these, and he started a sawmill as early as 1853, because here's his new town. Most all of the buildings to be built at first would be wood frame structures, and they needed lots and lots of lumber to build all these buildings that were in the process of being built. So he opened a sawmill operated by Stephen Adams on Indianapolis Avenue. Said it was halfway between 3rd and 4th Street on the east side of the street, and operated until 1855. December of 1852, Meedy was given the go-ahead to have a post office established here in his new town of Seymour. So that he was appointed as postmaster, probably because he's the one who applied for the post office. But he soon gave that job to his friend Travis Carter, and it's said that Travis kept what little mail that was coming into the citizens at the time in a bureau drawer on the 2nd floor of his house, which is the one that I showed you earlier. Let's see, the first train on the east-west line, the Ohio and Mississippi Railroad, which came from Cincinnati, headed for St. Louis, Missouri, across southern Indiana. The tracks reached Seymour in 1854. The first train on the tracks got here June the 29th of 1854. had quite a celebration here for them. As I mentioned in more detail in the other video, it took about 3 years to build the tracks from the west of here because of some tunnels that had to be dug. So from 1854 to 1857, Seymour was the end of the line for the Ohio-Mississippi Railroad, which is pretty advantageous for the town itself. So I mentioned that Rockford to the north of here was a thriving community, and there's way more than I should or can have the time to get into now, but there became a series of mysterious fires that were set in Rockford and basically burned one at a time most of the buildings down up in that area, and one by one those businesses a lot of times would move down to the new town of Seymour and reestablish themselves here. In September of 1855, Meedy ran an ad in the local newspapers as far away as even Cincinnati that he would give a free lot and $100 cash to any church that would come to Seymour and establish a church building in his town. First to do so was the First Presbyterian Church, and they were actually first located on the southwest corner of 2nd and Chestnut. They built there in August of 1857. Second was the First Methodist Church, and their first location was the northwest corner of 2nd and Ewing. Third was the First Baptist Church, southwest corner of Walnut and Tipton in 1859, and the fourth was St. Paul's, catty-cornered from where the First Baptist Church was located. That was 1859 as well. There were additions to the town added, and I'll show those here after I get through. I'll show you on a map where those were located. 1856, Meedy is elected again as senator, but this time it was for Jackson and Jennings counties. And because of the rivalry between Rockford and Seymour, John Kestner somehow had gotten the north-south line, the J&I, to not stop in the town of Seymour. So people wanting to go north and south on that railroad would have to go to Rockford or south to a little town called Farmington to get on the train. After he was re-elected as senator in 1856, he started promoting a bill in the state legislature which would, for safety's sake, require any train to come to a complete stop if they crossed another railroad line. That was passed in March of 1857, which forced the J&I to stop in the town of Seymour, and they finally built at least just a small platform for people to get on and off the trains after that. But that bill actually helped lots of towns in similar situations across the United States. So through the late 1850s and into the early 1860s, there's just a whole long list of businesses that slowly left the Rockford area and moved into the new town of Seymour. In 1860, the census showed the population of Seymour as 924 people. April 6th of 1864, Seymour was voted on to become incorporated. They tried a couple of times, and it finally did at that date. Then June the 22nd, 1864, Seymour was incorporated with a population of 1,553 people. 2 days later, June the 24th, 1864, the city charter was obtained, and the first mayor was elected as George Green, who unfortunately, as far as I know, is not any population of mine. 1866 is where I'll stop on the timeline this time, because that is the year that both Meedy and his wife passed away. His wife had been ill for quite some time, and she had basically become an invalid, and he had spent a lot of his time for a while just taking care of her. After 1866, then the rest of the family took over, especially his son Lycurgus. Okay, so this is a map, or a series of maps to help you understand the growth of Seymour. This shows the greater downtown area of the city, and in the yellow you see the original layout for the original town of Seymour. This was laid out April of 1852. So August 29th, 1854, the area in green was added to the city. So areas south of the East-West Railroad tracks, which included the areas that the O&M shops were built at that time. They brought those into the city limits. This would be February 1856, February 12th. The purple shaded area was added to the city, so south of the town on the east side of the railroad tracks. And September 23rd, 1858, the area in pink, which includes most of the current downtown commercial district, was added to the city. Finally, by the end of 1858, there was quite a growth spurt, and all the areas that shaded in brown were added by the end of the year to the city, and different additions to the city of Seymour. In case you're wondering, I'm sitting on my back porch at home right now, but I just thought of something I wanted to include in this video, and so I'll record it here and edit it in. I wanted to talk to you about the timeline, or a typical timeline of commercial buildings in the early Seymour. For the first 10 years or so of Seymour's existence, every building that was built was of wood frame construction, so that would include, of course, the houses, which is typical today even, but the commercial buildings would have been wood frame structures as well. Some of them were built just like a typical house style, but were open for stores, and others I think would have been similar to what you see in the old Western style movies. The downtown, usually just a one-story commercial building. But if a business was successful, generally what would happen, then the owner would purchase a different lot to build on once their business was successful, and then they would start building a more substantial brick, usually 2-story, sometimes 3-story building, with the commercial business on the first floor, and a lot of times the owner would live on the second floor. Sometimes they would rent some other rooms upstairs for commercial offices and such. This would have been, the earliest brick buildings in Seymour were built in the early 1860s then, and one of my cats just said hi to you. And then further on down the timeline, with if the business was particularly successful, typically the owner then would build a pretty substantial residence just outside of the downtown business district, and move out of the upstairs into their nice new home. And that's what a lot of the large homes, especially along North and South Chestnut Street, just outside the commercial district, are. Just thought I'd share that with you. So that concludes my second video of Seymour history. I hope you liked it. Hope you learned a few things maybe. If you're happy with what I've done, might hit the like button, hit the subscribe button if you'd like to be notified when additional videos come out. Thank you. Have a good day. Bye.